Buenos días.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and welcome. Welcome to this seminar that we have organized to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the NATO, which was created in 1949. And as our followers know, the Instituto Elcano, ever since its creation in 2001, has devoted part of its activities and efforts to a better understanding and a better comprehension of the North Atlantic Alliance. Part of our work has aimed at disseminating about the great work that the Alliance has done ever since it was created. And those who follow us even closer will remember that in 2002, that was the NATO year for our institute. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of Spain's adhesion to the Alliance, and we did so by drafting a book and interviewing some of the key stakeholders from the civil and military standpoint to this achievement. And after that, as you very well know, there was a brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which changed and completely disrupted the defense and security scenario in the continent. And in 2002, we also had the honor and the pleasure of participating in the organization of the public forum of the NATO, spin-off event of the NATO Summit that took place here in Madrid, and which resulted also in the strategic concept which was approved in that summit. So as I said before, part of what we have been doing in the last few years has revolved around bringing closer to the Spanish public opinion and Spanish experts to the activities of the Alliance. On the 24th of February 2022, as Roosevelt said, after Pearl Harbor's attack, I don't have a good translation for this.
Y lamentablemente seguimos todavía.
And unfortunately, we still live the consequences of that brutal, unjustified and illegal attack. I don't think there's anything positive about the war, the Ukraine war, but at least in the Spanish context, it's worth highlighting that thanks to Mr. Putin, Spaniards have perhaps become more aware, more knowledgeable about what NATO means. In Elcano in June 2022, we performed a survey, and according to it, 83% of Spanish citizens supported the presence of our country in the Alliance. Therefore, we could state at least that this terrible war has made it possible for many Spaniards to come to understand better that we live in an increasingly uncertain and unstable world in which NATO plays an increasingly important role. Now, in hindsight, what NATO has done ever since Ukraine was invaded by Russia, well, there's some reasons for satisfaction. We have 2 new members in NATO, Finland and Sweden. This has indeed reinforced the alliance, and it's also better prepared to face the Russian threat, but also undoubtedly better suited to face the rise of China and if its more important role in the Pacific. The alliance and NATO has been essential for this. This has served the purpose of reinvigorating the defense industry, a very important sector for Spain, very well represented amongst the sponsors of Elcano, and it also has become important for the NATO to become aware of the actions of Russia in some countries in the world, like for instance in Latin America, a region that is so important for us, and also it has become more aware of the role of Russia in Africa. So maybe I'm just making virtue out of need, but there's no room for self-complacency, and we can say that the events that have taken place in the last few years have helped NATO become more present in public discourse and public awareness. And as I said before, we have some keynote speakers here to discuss some of these achievements, to take stock, but also to look into the future, thinking also about the NATO Summit that will take place in Washington in the month of July. And with the support of our keynote speakers, we would like to explore that horizon and discuss to what extent NATO is ready to face up to these challenges that are increasingly pressing. And also we will put our fingers on some of the gaps, the difficulties, problems that the Alliance will have to tackle in future months and years. And today we have with us Carmen Romero. Thank you very much, Carmen, for being here with us. Carmen is a dear friend, and she's the most important Spaniard at OTAN, at NATO rather, and that's something that she takes with pride, but humbly, with humbleness. And she is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy at NATO, and she will be taking a new position at NATO. Perhaps later she will speak on her new role in the Alliance, and we hope, Carmen, that as part of your new responsibility, you continue to offer us the invaluable support that you have offered to us so far. Thank you very much. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Suspense, no? I will give you the details over lunch. Muchas gracias, Charles.
Thank you so very much, Charles, and good day, everyone. Thanks a lot to Elcano for their relentless efforts for our society to better understand safety and security. Defense and security, rather. Thanks for being loyal collaborators of NATO. Our collaboration is very important, and I can only share words of gratitude about what you do and what you say. And this conference, as Charles said, is dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the Alliance and the journey from the Madrid Summit to the Washington Summit. I will begin by speaking about the 75th anniversary because it provides a unique opportunity to remind experts, and there's quite a few experts here with us, also opinion makers present here with us too, and citizens in general, of what NATO has contributed with over the decades of its existence. And on the occasion of the anniversary, our Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reminds us that the Alliance's main achievements are three. First, that its members have been able to remain united in spite of their many differences, and imagine there's quite a few of us, around its core mission to defend and protect each other and to keep our citizens safe. The second achievement is that the Alliance has helped spread peace, democracy and prosperity throughout Europe. It started out with 12 members and now it has 32, as Charles pointed out. And third, that the Alliance has remained strong. But how has it remained strong over this 75 years? Well, because it has been able to continuously adapt. Every time the world has changed, NATO has changed to respond accordingly. And this anniversary also invites us to recall briefly the continuous adaptation and to ponder on how an alliance of 32 members continues to be so relevant today. Well, we know that since 1949 and for 40 years, NATO had one mission, which was to deter the Soviet Union. And what were the achievements of NATO apart from deterring the Soviet Union during that period? Well, its greatest success was that it contributed to ending the Cold War. In the 1990s, NATO acted beyond its borders, projecting stability in our neighborhood, especially in Europe, helping to put an end to conflicts in the Western Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo. And in 2021, following the September 11 attack on the Twin Towers. It also contributed to battling or combating international terrorism. With the end of the Cold War, Russia ceased to be an adversary. NATO built a very strong partnership with Moscow, and Russia became a privileged partner. And this is something that I like to point out, because sometimes NATO is perceived as anti-Russian, but when it's been necessary, it has. But for 3 decades, we worked together, and there was a lot of political dialogue and practical cooperation. For 3 decades, we jointly built a security architecture based on predictability, which is very important, and also an international order which is based on rules. And during that time we also cut defense expenditure because there was more security, and we focused on external threats beyond our borders. But in 2014 the world changed again. Russia openly challenged that order with the illegal addition of Crimea and its entry into the Donbas in Ukraine, and this called NATO to go back to its initial intent, which was collective defense, focusing on deterrence and defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. Since 2014, what we did was to reinforce our collective defense, the greatest since the end of Cold War. But as a defensive organization, which it is, the NATO did it focusing on deterrence in order to prevent conflicts and to send clear images to any potential adversaries, including Russia, for them not to challenge NATO. And with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the security context changed again, and Moscow also unleashed the most severe international security crisis since the end of World War. And this brings me to the present day and NATO's actions at the Madrid Summit and vis-a-vis Washington. And I was thinking, okay, Madrid and Washington, lots of things have changed since the Madrid Summit in 2022 in June, when the new SDG concept was approved, the one that is standing. But things that haven't changed are the political priorities of the alliance. And we got to the Madrid Summit with 4 priorities, and those are the same 4 priorities that we will be taking to the Washington Summit in June. First, reinforcing our deterrence and defense to try and prevent Russia from extending the world on Ukraine, but we don't want to do this from an escalation perspective. Second, we want to support Ukraine. Thirdly, emphasizing cooperation with our members, defending our values and international defense, and also fourth, focusing on the future NATO. And there's 3 things that have changed in the international security scene. First, when we met in Madrid Summit, Ukraine surprised the world, repelling Russia's advance. With international help, it regained 50% of the invaded territory. 2 years later, at this point in time, Russia is talking Ukraine from the military perspective because help has been insufficient. But new help and assistance is underway, and it's not too late for Ukraine to win. And this is precisely what the Secretary General said last week in Ukraine in a meeting he held with Zelensky. Therefore, right now we need to do everything in our hands to support Kiev with air defense and ammunition. And this is truly urgent. And as Stoltenberg said, assistance to Ukraine is not charity. It's an investment in our own security to try and prevent authoritarian regimes to afford to change borders that are internationally recognized through the use of force. Second, when we met in Madrid in 2022, we started to see the global consequences of Russia's aggression, but this have become accentuated in the last 2 years. One of the consequences of the Russian aggression is that our security is no longer regional, but rather global. Obviously, NATO is and will remain a regional security organization, but the global impact of this war has led the alliance to intensify cooperation with its partners. And third, when the NATO leaders met in Madrid in 2022 and a year later in Lithuania, they agreed on the strongest defense plans since the end of the Cold War, designed to counter the two main threats to our security, according to a strategic concept approved in Madrid: Russia and terrorism. And since then, I can assure you that that military transformation has progressed by leaps and bounds. Now I'll focus on the road to Washington. I said that we will have 4 priorities, just like the ones that we had in the Madrid Summit. First, NATO leaders will be making decisions to strengthen our deterrence and defense. This includes, as I said before, improving our air and missile defenses, but also more joint procurement and strengthening our industrial base. As you know, deterrence and defense are the cornerstone of collective defense and our #1 priority. Deterrence and defense strengthened, as I said earlier, to prevent war, not to provoke it. In Washington, we will see the culmination of the defense plans agreed at the 2 previous summits. And in Lithuania, the allies adopted something very important, the Defense Production Action Plan, to aggregate demand, boost capacity and increase interoperability. All this will be renewed at the Washington Summit. Allies are increasing procurement and the production of military equipment and ammunition to increase defense, and using the alliance defense planning process to provide the defense industry with a long-term demand signal that it needs to boost production. And obviously, all this cannot be done if we do not invest more in defense, if we don't invest the famous 2% of our GDP in our defense, which is now the starting point, not the destination. At least that's what the member countries agreed on in the Lithuanian summit last year. And this commitment has become urgent to generate the forces and capabilities needed in a security environment that has changed and that is here to stay. Therefore, a clear priority for leaders in Washington will be defense spending. In order to counter growing global threats, we need sustained spending. That's what has been agreed upon by the allies. And we can say that a record number of allies between 18 and 20, we're still getting the figures right, will meet a minimum spending target of 2% of GDP this very year. The second priority is Ukraine. My colleagues, communicators told me that priority #1 should be Ukraine and not deterrence and defense. So we could say that Ukraine is actually the first priority. So in Washington, what is it that we're going to do? We had the Vilnius summit. There was a lot of political discussion. Well, in Washington, what our leaders will be doing will be to offer Kyiv an unprecedented aid package that will serve as a bridge, and that's how it will be defined, to prepare Ukraine to join the alliance when the time comes. An invitation won't be issued to Ukraine in Washington, but there will be key decisions that will place Ukraine at the right place to be ready to join the alliance when the time comes. NATO is working to change the dynamics of the support provided to Ukraine, and something that will change will be that aid will be institutionalized to make it more predictable in the short, medium and long term. NATO has decided that it will assume greater responsibility in coordinating military assistance to Ukraine and for training its future security force that will have to deter and defend if the time comes. So what we're doing at NATO is working to implement or to put in motion this package for it to be approved by leaders and for Ukraine to be in the right condition to apply NATO's standards across the board from procurement to logistics. But I must also say that at the same time, our Secretary General is really working day in and day out so that the allied countries can give Ukraine the military equipment that it urgently needs. And only that will help Kyiv resist the Russian attack that we're witnessing right now and counter as soon as possible to regain the invaded territory. And with this, what we can do is to support Ukraine to be in a position to negotiate a fair and lasting peace. So providing arms is the way to peace. And something that is very important, the third priority will be partnership in Washington. The South will play a predominant role. As you know, the South was very important at the Madrid Summit and will be very more important in Washington. Ana Santos Pinto will talk about this, and she will join us in a few minutes, because NATO leaders will agree on concrete steps to intensify their offer of security cooperation to partners in the Middle East and North of Africa. And all this because the conflict and instability in the South have a direct impact on our security. NATO's new policy towards the South will identify opportunities and challenges coming from these countries and will be based on the recommendations of a group of independent experts appointed by the Secretary General, led by Ana. This group is led by Ana. We also had a Spanish expert, and allies are exploring opportunities for greater political dialogue, more public diplomacy and closer cooperation with the South's neighbors. And some of the practical areas that we will be working on with these countries are counterterrorism, maritime security, climate change, cybersecurity and demining. But Ana will share further details about this. Now, about partnerships. In Washington, NATO will also strengthen its cooperation with Australia, Korea, Japan and New Zealand. For the third time in a row, we will meet with our partners in Asia Pacific, the heads of state and government levels. The first time was in Madrid Summit, and this will serve the purpose of further strengthening our political dialogue and practical cooperation, particularly on cutting-edge technologies, cyber and hybrid threats. And some of the things that are a greater concern to us are the growing convergence between authoritarian regimes, China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. These countries do not share our values or respect international law, and this has consequences for regional and global security. It is important indeed for European security and for the security of the Indo-Pacific. And I would like to illustrate the situation with some facts and data about China. We are concerned that Beijing is propping up Russia's war economy. It is providing Moscow with cutting-edge technology as semiconductors and other dual-use items, military and specific purposes. And according to our data, last year Russia imported 90% of its microelectronics from China, and it uses it to produce missiles, tanks and aircraft. And China is also working to provide Russia with enhanced satellite capabilities and imaging. So China is helping bolster Russia's defense industrial base and evade the impact of sanctions and export controls. Therefore, Beijing continues to fuel the biggest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. About North Korea, well, it's also providing ammunition and projectiles to Russia, more than a million ammunition. And Iran is providing drones to Moscow, and it's also foreseen to transferring ballistic missiles to Moscow. In return for the support, North Korea and Iran are receiving Russian technology and supplies to help them improve their nuclear and missile capabilities. So it is clear that these authoritarian powers are increasingly aligned. This leads me to talk about the importance of resilience and our relationship with Beijing. At the Washington Summit, the allies will address the growing geostrategic competition and how to increase our resilience in general, but also vis-à-vis China. The allies will approve a set of measures to increase the resilience, and as backdrop we have the mistake that we made in the past of being too dependent on Russian oil and gas, and our member countries are trying to reduce dependency from Beijing, because that makes us more vulnerable also from the standpoint of security, and to be less dependent on the raw materials and technologies. This taking into account that China is not an adversary, China is not Russia for NATO, but its increasing coercive actions represent a challenge to our security, our values, and our interests. And this is how the Chinese challenge was defined at the Madrid Summit. With China, we have a very important political dialogue at all levels, at high, middle and lower levels. Unfortunately, it's not the case with Russia, and we're already talking to potential collaborations with Beijing, like arms control and climate change. And the fourth political priority of the summit will be to continue to try and make NATO prepared to face the increasing hybrid threats and to maintain its technological advantage, which helps protect more than 1 billion people living in the 32 member states and defend their values and their way of life. And to conclude, from my standpoint, NATO is today more relevant than ever because it's responding to a security context which is more dangerous, perhaps the most unpredictable and dangerous security context in one generation. Thank you very much. Thank you so very much, Carmen, for this general perspective in which you have discussed many of the topics that we will try to explore further during our roundtable. And in order to do this, we have 4 speakers.
And I'd like to first of all thank you all for being here. I will kick off with Per Christiansen from Norway. He is the chairperson of the NATO Defense Industrial Production Board and the NATO Support and Procurement Organization. Thank you very much, Per, for being with us today. I will then turn to Mida Milosevic, who is our Senior Research Fellow at the Elcano Royal Institute. Thank you for joining us, Mida. Lovely to have you again. I will then ask Ana Santos Pinto. Ana, bem-vinda, bom dia. She is joining us from Lisbon. Ana is a professor at the Universidade Nova in Lisbon, and as Carmen has already mentioned, she has been leading this experts group, which has produced a report which is being presented today, I believe. And she will tell us about the report. We also wanted to invite Carlos Carnero, the Spanish member of that team. I don't think he's in the room, but I just wanted to say that I know he has been making a very interesting and significant contribution to that task force appointed by the NATO Secretary General. So it'll be very interesting from a Spanish perspective as well, an Iberian perspective, if you will, to hear about what Ana will have to tell us about NATO's involvement in the South. And last but by no means least, we have Han ten Broeke, who is Director of Political Affairs at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Han, many thanks for coming here. This is his first time in Madrid.
It is.
So nobody's perfect, I guess. But it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much, all of you, for making the effort. So let me start with you, Per. Carmen was very upbeat. It's her job to be upbeat about NATO's state of preparedness. But I would like to ask you, first of all, how prepared is NATO really in strictly military terms and also in industrial terms? Many of our societies have suddenly woken up and smelt the coffee to some extent. We we lived in a sort of world in which war would no longer be commonplace on the continent of Europe. We've had a massive wake-up call, a dramatic wake-up call. So the question, first of all, is how prepared are we for this new era of strategic competition? And what challenges keep you awake at night? You know what's underneath the rhetoric, you know what's underneath the narratives. What really worries you? Per.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I will not go into the military preparedness. I'm not a military officer, and if I knew it, it would probably be classified, so I would not be able to discuss it. But looking at the industrial side, I think I have something more to tell you about. Yes, we had a wake-up call. You said it was nothing good with the Russian invasion to Ukraine, but it has been very useful for us because it has reminded us about the purpose of our alliance. Also in a micro level, since I'm the chair of the NSPO Agency Supervisory Board, and this agency is located in Luxembourg, very peaceful place. When I started to talk about that, actually we are facing a war in Europe now. Should we look at our business processes? There were many people that ask, why on earth should we do this? We are doing this business successfully for 40 years. So why should we look on simplification, debureaucratization, making us able to make timely decisions? Because this is what our organization is about. It's about making decisions together. And with 32 nations, that can sometimes be cumbersome, but that is also the strength of our alliance. So this wake-up call that you referred to referred also to our organization internally. But then also, of course, in the interface between governments and industry, because it's also about how the customer and the industry relate to each other. Do they understand each other? Do they understand the way of thinking? Do governments understand that the way of thinking of industry is that they want to be able to control the risk? They want to control the risk with regard to investments that can increase the industrial capacity. And do they understand that a part of this risk is if they are unpredictable? Because there's a lot happening in governments, and I can quote Otto von Bismarck that said that you don't want to know how you make sausages and how politics are made. So in order also to what I mentioned for our little organization in Luxembourg, I think this also applies for governments. Furthermore, I think that in order for governments to contribute to the increase of the industrial capacity, they need to think in a very broad term. At our first meeting in the Defense Industrial Production Board, our Spanish colleague here mentioned the access to accreditation institutions. This can sound like it does not have anything to do with industrial capacity, but it has, because in order to cooperate, and that's one of the clues we need to look for here, is how can we make countries cooperate to procure from industry. We need to be, to a certain extent, standardized. We need to have sometimes also commonality, but to verify that you actually have it, you need to have something to accredit. And if you don't have it, then you fail. But also other things like financial laws. I think the financial laws is created in a way that everything is going to happen during 12 months. And it makes it very difficult. It makes it very difficult to have a long-term perspective for industry, for instance, and that's a risk factor. Is this discussed among governments around? I don't know. Access to capital, financial capital. There is a certain stigma with regard to defense industry. So they don't have this, in all countries, the same access to capital as the other part of industry. And furthermore, also, what about the workforce, a competent workforce in industry? Their ministries of education needs to contribute. What does this sum up with? It sums up with that you need to have a whole of government approach to this. So, what is the state of our industry today? Well, we talked about the 2%, and with the increased budgets now, I think all over NATO, it's not the money that is lacking, it's the industrial capacity. And I hope that we can have a focus on the quality on how we spend this money as well, because only to focus on these 2% is not enough. We need to spend them wisely, spend them with industry, not waste money in a certain sense, because we need to meet this target. But in order to do that, we need to increase the industrial capacity. I think I will stop there. I did not exactly answer your question, but I learned that. We're working in the Ministry of Defense for some time, so I know the techniques that politicians sometimes use in order to not directly to reply to the questions.
You almost sounded like a politician for a minute, yeah. No, but you've touched on some very important points. So we were obsessed with the 2% spending target. The United States spends, what, $800 billion a year in defense. We in Europe spend about $200 billion. That's a lot of money, European money. It's a lot of money in America as well, but it's a lot of European money. And of course, a lot of the people listening to us now may be wondering, is this money being spent well? And you, to some extent, have already given us an answer. You are concerned that we don't have, perhaps, the labor force that we need. We don't actually have the industrial capacity that we need. So we may actually be throwing a lot of money at this issue, but we're not really providing the best answers. So what would you like NATO to do, specifically NATO to do, to help European defense industries step up to the plate and provide a better answer to this challenge?
I think first I would like to comment on the 2% metrics, because I have concern with this concept, but we need to remember and need to understand the context. Firstly, it's a politically very important signal to the outside world that the 32 nations are willing to spend money. We are serious about defending our alliance. And secondly, and that's internal, and that's burden sharing. And you touched upon that, showing the figures for the U.S. and Europe here. And it's important of that reason as well. And the burden sharing discussion has been attributed to Trump, but this is a much older discussion that have showed up from time to time in the alliance. And so from that perspective, I think that this is, we need to understand the 2%. And then I forgot your question.
What would you like NATO to do more effectively to help the European defense industry?
Yeah. Depends on what you mean by NATO. If you mean NATO as collectively, what the NATO collectively can do, NATO can collectively, we can facilitate cooperation between nations in order to go to industry. And to give you an example, we have, for instance, we will probably discussed this also the afternoon. We have Diana, that is a NATO initiative to develop new technology. Okay, we develop this new technology, but if we don't get it out in the field, we are not succeeded. So what NATO needs to do then, and need to have mechanism that we can use this technology, and that nations who want to use it for a specific purpose can go together and cooperate and buy this together with industry and have this organized interface with industry, for instance, through my organization, the NSPO. That is a very important thing. But I think we need to realize that most of this, there are the nations who have to do the work themselves. It's not, we cannot do it, we cannot do that collectively. For instance, we have this issue about export control, that some nations said that we need to or we should not restrict export control too much. Yes, that's fine, but first and foremost, this is a national responsibility. So we need to acknowledge that actually it's the nations that have to do the changes. And many of these examples I gave you in my first intervention was also related to what nations can do, and not so much collectively. But NATO is a place where nations come together, they raise their concern, then they go back, maybe they change something, and this will also be the same in the future, I think. So that's the, and we can also exchange best practices among nations. That's also very important, because Spain is not the same as Norway, for instance.
Sure.
We can learn something from Spain, Spain can learn something from Norway.
Okay, Per, thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those issues later. So Mida, tell us a little, you've been following the war in Ukraine for the last 2 years. It's very much part of your daily life now, for better or for worse. I'd like to start by asking you, what is your understanding of the current dynamic on the ground, the military situation on the ground? Secondly, the US has just approved a supplemental budget of about $60 billion US dollars. Is this a question of too little, too late? Of course, it was a wonderful thing when this measure was approved, but if you listen to some of our Ukrainian friends, they are bleeding. They are suffering very, very badly. And some of us feel that perhaps, these 60 billion are a token of goodwill and politically motivated, perhaps, more than motivated by real hard defense considerations. So what's your interpretation of what the impact of this money will be on the campaign?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning for everyone, and thank you for coming. Carmen Romero has already described very well with a lot of details about the priorities of NATO and Ukraine, and about this last financial support, military support to Ukraine. But always during these 2 years, when I have been talking about the war in Ukraine, I always said the easier way to understand it is to just put in structure of 3 levels of political, strategic, and tactical level. And what is the most important thing here is that on the political level, Ukraine does not change its political goals, which is to defend its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and to regain all of its territory. And even now, Ukraine is losing on the tactical level. It's very important to highlight that Ukraine are not changing its political objectives. And if we conserve these political objectives, I think that the hope of the victory of Ukraine is more possible, because finally wars many times are a question of will also. And it's important for that Ukraine conserve its political objectives. On strategic level, I think that is very important to highlight how Russia successfully adapted on strategic level relatively fastly because in 2022 Russia failed, but during these 2 years, but above all last year, Russia has been adapting very well. Its military industry, but also, of course, its strategies on the battle. And now on the tactical level, which is, I think, here the most worrying issue, because it's true, it's obvious that the counter-offensive of Ukraine of last year failed, and that in this moment Ukraine is losing the war, because Russia every day is in Donbass region above all is advancing, and maybe even more worrying is that Russia is systematically destroying the Ukrainian infrastructures, and energetic and all. So in this moment Russia is winning, but the one thing is to lose the battle and another to lose the war. So this is our hope. I agree with you that the Western help to Ukraine maybe is too little and too late, definitely is late. And the problem is if we in future will have the same problem. If we need 6 months to agree about what and how we will help Ukraine, that will be a huge problem, independently if Donald Trump will win or not. The Biden administration has this problem, and we will see what are the consequences of this. With the armament which Ukraine received, I think that will tend to hold the line, to have active defense, and will try to stop the Russians, will try to defend itself better and prepare for a counter-offensive in 2025. But as Carmen highlighted, and General Secretary of NATO, this package will be not sufficient for this counter-offensive. What is now very, very important is that the West should and have and must to continually to help Ukrainian military. And I think that the decision of NATO is one very, very good and very important thing, that which independently who will win presidential elections in the United States, is good to have NATO, which has already adopted decision and have short, medium and long time plans how to support Ukraine. So I think that is a very good news for Ukraine. And I would like to conclude with two, I don't want to be downer, but I would like to highlight two huge problems from my point of view. The first one and the most serious problem in Ukrainian is war fatigue among Ukrainians, among public opinion, Western public opinion. We are talking about NATO, of course, and there is a high level of conscience what does it mean to lose war in Ukraine. But I think that there is a clear fatigue in public opinion in the West, and there is fatigue of war in Ukraine. And above all, the problem also is the lack of soldiers. Many Ukrainian men have been unwilling to join the mobilization, and we know that there was a problem between General Zaluzhin and Zelensky on how to organize this mobilization. Meanwhile, Russians, that will be third mobilization, and maybe easily Russia will have new 300,000 soldiers in the battle. So I think that it is a serious problem, and this problem does not depend on NATO. It's Ukrainian problem. And second problem is is escalation, not because of NATO, not because of defense of Ukraine, but because of Russia. I mean, the best job and the main job of the NATO is deterrence, and NATO did it wonderful. I think that Russia will not attack any NATO country because we'll lose the war, definitely. But I could not exclude escalation because of the Western support to Ukraine. As Dmitry Peskov said 2 days ago, that the red line for Russia would be NATO missiles and NATO soldiers in Ukrainian territory. So I think that we have to take it in mind, and Russia could escalate in Ukraine, not attacking NATO country, but in Ukraine maybe could do that.
Let me ask you, since you're a Russia watcher, the bear in the room is a restless bear, and you have studied, for example, Russian presence in other parts of the world. Where should we be looking hardest? Where should we be most worried about Russian influence? In the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America even?
I think that Russia has faced very solid deterrence and containment in the Eastern Front. So after that, now Russia is looking to intensify its presence in another parts of the world, and this is a kind of great game 2.0. I mean, during the 19th century, the British Empire and Russian Empire had competed in the Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on, and that was a great game 1.0, let's say. Now, the great game 2.0 is in all global parts of is a global. Is many more actors. This game is happening in many territories. So I think that in the Middle East, North Africa, and Sahel, Russia above all in Sahel, find a very good place to expand its influence and presence. And I think the starting point of it is that the deterrence of the West really failed since the war in Syria in 2013, after the red lines of Obama, and then when the red lines became rose lines, when Bashar al-Assad used the chemical weapons, and of course the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021. From the point of view of the Kremlin, was that is a huge opportunity. That is like a new world order. The U.S. failed. So I think that the lack of deterrence in this region, and what is our Spanish, one of the biggest challenges for our security, and of course for security of NATO, because we are the southern border of NATO, we have to pay attention, of course, for it. But also Latin America is there, and as I said, the Great Game 2.0 will be in all places with many actors. And I would like to conclude, because we have here the wake-up call. I'm fed up of wake-up call. Pandemic is wake-up call. The war in Ukraine is wake-up call. So I was very tired.
We need a rest.
But then I read what Ivan Krastev said, and I like it very much, and I would like to conclude with it. Krastev said one thing is wake-up call. One thing is wake up. Another thing is to have energy to get out from the bed. And I would like to wish to NATO and to all of us just to have energy to get out of the bed, because we are waked up, definitely.
Thank you. So we have insomnia, but it may not.
Yeah, we are
then.
somnambules, maybe.
Okay.
Let's manage it. Woke up and
Do something about it.
Yes.
Okay. That's it. We have a plan. Let's
Yeah.
get out of bed. Anna, so let me transition seamlessly to you. Amida was beginning to talk to us about Russian threats in the Sahel in particular, and you have formed part, you have led this group of experts from different NATO countries. Our colleague and friend Carlos Carnero, whom I mentioned earlier, took part in this exercise as well. So could you tell us a little about this exercise that you've been involved in, and also what are your main conclusions? What do you think NATO should be doing or could be doing that it hasn't been doing so far? Carlos Carnero was telling me, I hope I'm not breaking the Chatham House rule here, that he's more of an EU person, and that initially, conceptually, it was rather difficult for him to think about NATO in the south. He was used to thinking about the EU's role in the south, but obviously that was the point of the exercise in which you have been involved. So can you tell us a little about what this experience has been like, and above all, what your recommendations for the future will be? Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. First of all, thank you for inviting me for this panel. I have to assume that today is a very special day for our expert group. The report is finally published. You can find it in the website of NATO. We have 114 recommendations, so we have a lot, and practical recommendations, not a subjective and ideal. And I will start exactly by the group. We are 11 from different allies, from the south, from the north, from the east, from Denmark to Poland, from Italy to Turkey, Greece. I think it was very important for us to have so different profiles. I come from the university, Carlos comes from the political life in the parliament. We have ambassadors, we have military, we have from two colleagues from think tanks. So we are a very different group, and we decided that we are going to use NATO methodology. That means unanimity. We consensualize all the words and all the recommendations, because that also reveals the difficulty between allies and states. And we feel that in order that everything that we recommend, I'm sorry, I'm at the Brussels airport going to Barcelona, so if you hear airport sound, I'm sorry. The question is exactly to be pragmatic. And this is one of the questions when we talk about NATO and the South that is very recurrent. What NATO has to do in the South? What is the role that NATO can have in the South? And that was exactly our starting point. And with this, I would like to highlight three main outputs of this report. The first one is about NATO itself. NATO, and speaking on a question that you have made previously regarding money that we spend and the results that we have. Mm-hmm. I think that NATO needs to look at itself and look on the collaborative environment and the relations, communication for the outside, the question of public diplomacy and strategic communication, but also the cooperation and collaboration inside NATO ecosystem between the international staff, the military committee, and the allies. And this, I think, will mean not only for the South, but when you have so many partners, when you have more than 130 instruments available to the parties, when you have a group of experts that work for 20 years in the topic, but need at least 2 months to understand how NATO works. We have 13 briefings with many different institutions in NATO. I imagine what is for a partner to interact with NATO and to understand what is the best way to cooperate and to relate with NATO on a win-win balance. So I think this is very important, and that's why we dedicate a chapter of the report on internal improvements that NATO could look to. The second output of the report is regarding the topics that we choose. We divided the report on the geographic delimitation, and we use the concept of neighborhoods in plural, because we are talking in different sub-regions: North Africa, Mediterranean, Middle East, Gulf, Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, the maritime adjacent areas as the Red Sea, and they are different between them. They demand different approaches, but we also have different states, different political communities inside these regions and sub-regions. So when we talk about a strategy, I think NATO must have very clear what it wants on the whole approach regarding the South, based, of course, in the strategic concept of 2022 approved in Madrid, and all the developments that we have since then, but also need to understand, engage, and listen to the partners. If I need to choose a sentence from the report, is listen more, engage harder, understand better. And this is a two-way approach. NATO to understand the partners, and partners also to understand NATO. This is made through political dialogue, but this is also made through credibility, through trust, through coherence. And I think this is very important when we look to perceptions and see that NATO is generally very negatively perceived in the South. And no one in the South really knows what NATO is. A military alliance, a political alliance. There is a huge confusion between NATO and the allies. There is no difference between bilateral cooperation of the allies and NATO efforts. Sometimes they overlap one to the other. And so I think it's important also to take into account these narratives and these perceptions. Last point that I would like to highlight in the report is the topics that we choose, of course, behind the geographical and the differentiation. They come from what we heard from the partners. And I would like to highlight three main topics: counterterrorism, maritime security, and climate change. And you can ask what NATO in the framework of the climate change could do in the South. And we have a huge amount of proposals. We are not saying that the report and these more than 100 recommendations are all to be implemented. We divided them in short term, medium term, and long term. They are interconnected, but they are also optional. It's for political decision makers to decide what is the road, what is the path. And from my experience, we should never lead political decision makers with one option. We have to give them at least two in order to provide an approach and the responsibility on that decision making. So that was our idea, to have different approaches on counterterrorism, on maritime security. I heard from Carmen the question of demining, for example. That was a project that was developed in the South, very important. But in maritime security connected with resilience, we are very keen in NATO, golden standard on protecting critical infrastructures. We are talking about undersea cables, fiber cables, but we are also talking about so simple things as illegal fishing that provides main resources for coastal communities, that China is there taking away the fish that allows that communities to survive, and something that NATO could help providing assistance on these illegal fishing, on satellite images that provide the states and military forces with capability to better answer to these illegal activities from fish and from criminal and organized crime. When we ask what NATO can engage with the South, well, there is a lot of things to do, but the first and foremost, for me the most important, and I really hope that our road to Washington leads, is to a political guidance regarding the South. We do not need to choose between East and South. It's not a zero-sum game. The 360 approach means that Russia is in the South, Iran is providing drones to Russia, to Ukraine. Disinformation is everywhere, from Africa to Middle East and to Gulf countries. We cannot divide one thing from the other. Russia is with Africa Corps in the Sahel in a very significant way. So our main idea is to highlight this interlinkage and to say that from the South, we don't have only threats and risks. We have also opportunities. And we need to acknowledge that for our Southern partners to engage in a more trustable and understanding way of relating Atlantic Alliance with the Southern partners.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. Now I understand why they asked you to lead this exercise, which is a massive undertaking. Are you concerned about how this will be received? You've suggested as much already. How this report will be received in parts of what in Elcano we call the plural South. We don't like the expression global South because we feel that this actually feeds into certain narratives which undermine us in our part of the world. Are you concerned? Are you worried that you will be accused of the usual, double standards, etc.? For example, in the light of the war, of the events currently taking place in Gaza, do you think that our potential southern partners will welcome this initiative? What specific aspects? You've mentioned counterterrorism, maritime security, and climate change. But what specific aspects of your report do you think might do most to facilitate its acceptance and a positive impact in the plural South?
I have zero concern because partners already read the report, and double standards is there, and we need to acknowledge the most critical questions, as the Gaza war also. We were nominated in October the 6th, so all the process of producing this report was interconnected with daily news from Ukraine and from Russia, but also from Gaza, and we approach all that topics in the report. We listen to partners. What we receive, not only for the meetings, we have a round of 12 meetings with different partners, even with different stakeholders that were not partners, but could and want to be in a closer relation with NATO. And the first message that they pass us was, thank you for listening to us and thank you for reflecting in the report what are our concerns. The second is exactly, I think our work as independent experts from outside NATO is to point out what it's normally not listened inside the echo chamber. When you look to an organization from the outside, you can identify some things that when you are in a daily basis, as you are in Elcano or I am in IPRI in Lisbon, we are not aware because it's our daily basis. This is the same thing. There are people that works in the same topic from 25 years inside NATO for the partnerships. And having this out-of-the-box approach with the indication that probably we can try a different way. And that is, for me, the most difficult thing on this exercise, because it demands a change of mindset. And it's very difficult, not only for allies, but also for institutional culture in alliance has with 75 years. It's like you ask to a 75 person to say, now you need to think differently. That is very important, but we know that it's not possible. But we need to acknowledge that perceptions, narratives have to be connected with reality. To have a narrative, to go on strategic communication or public diplomacy, I have to have a story to tell.
Sure.
So I need to have a political message and a military basis that, because NATO has these two branches, to connect with the partners. And the question of double standards, the question of East and South, the question of threats and risks, and no word about opportunities, that is taken into account. And that needs to be acknowledged also.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. We'll let you go and let you catch
Thank
your
you
flight.
very much.
And
Thank you.
it'll be fascinating
It was
to
a pleasure.
see. Obrigado. It'll be fascinating to see the impact of this. Carmen is looking quite happy, so I guess everything's going to be okay. But it'll be fascinating to see what those internal recommendations are. I look forward to reading the report and how this is going to impact NATO itself as an organization. So thank you, Anna. Han, let me finally turn over to you. We have two big events on the horizon: European elections in June and the U.S. presidential election in November. We're all worried about the consequences, the possible consequences of both of those events. In Europe, we fear that there may be a backlash against some of the policies that this Commission has been sponsoring, in particular, perhaps with regard to climate change, among others. And of course, we all have big questions about what the possible outcome of the US elections might be, specifically, and this is what I want to ask you about, the impact of this on the future of the transatlantic relationship. Now, it's difficult to unpack all of this in 5-10 minutes. But the point, I think, that I would like to stress is that there's an enormous potential for future divisions within the transatlantic relationship.
Yes.
Please, what's your take on this?
Let me first reiterate what Carmen said. I mean, the interesting thing about NATO over the 75 years, and Anna was just alluding to that as well, when you would ask a 75-year-old to change his or her mind, and then everybody feels that that could be a difficult task for them. Well, NATO has proven to be extremely flexible over time. And so it's a very resilient organization. And there's always division luring, one way or another. And I was struck by what Mira just said when Ivan Krastev, who I know well, a great guy, fantastic guy, when he said, we don't need more wake-up calls. We need to get out of bed. I was thinking everybody can relate to this. When you have this alarm clock and you press slumber mode, and that's 10 minutes, and then you get another 10 minutes. Maybe we should simply make a defunct out of that. And no more slumber mode for NATO. And I think we got out of slumber mode for a couple of particular reasons, mostly, of course, the Russian invasion in 2022. I've been a politician myself, and by the way, this is my first time in Madrid, and thank you for pointing that out, but also thank you for making me feel so comfortable, because the screen behind you actually portrays a picture of my working environment for 13, 14 years. This is the Dutch governmental and parliamentary center. It's called the Binnenhof. And I've been working there for 14 years, basically, so I feel very much at home
Carefully
here.
planned, all of this.
Carefully planned. It's very nice of you, thank you. But as a former politician, I can also tell you, and this is, let me then also respond a little bit to my dear colleagues in the panel. There's a couple of things where we actually have woken up. First, on the 2%, the Wales pledge. I have seen with my own eyes, and I'm a politician from a moderate right-wing party. By the way, my name is Ioannis, if you translate it, but I'm very much a fan of Mark Rutte. I hope you are too. Will be good for his candidacy for the NATO Secretary General. But I've seen how easy it is for politicians, even politicians from the right, to not take defense at heart when budget cuts are required. Let's just assume for a minute that all of us would have been living up to this Wales pledge of 2% before Russia invaded Ukraine. Then we all know that we had 2 years of COVID that immediately took a bite out of our GDP. The simple calculation would then have been that we would have had to do budget cuts on the military. We had to reduce spending. So in a way, this 2% has been a bit of a fig leaf for a very long time. And when it didn't become a fig leaf, I would argue it is at least intellectually poor. And it is also a task for think tanks like your reputed institution, Elcano, but even the institution that I come and sit on this panel for, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and all the other think tanks around Europe, to not just press on 2% or spending levels, which would be a minimum spending level. I agree with you, it's not a destination, it's a starting point. In the Netherlands, we've now enshrined it into law so that it is actually a starting point. But still, it is intellectually poor to think like that. What should happen, obviously, is that we agree on what the security situation actually is. And that analysis should then feed into how we spend our money.
Sure.
Let me start with that. Then the second thing on what Mira had to say on Ukraine. You started, Charles, with asking her what about this package that the Senate now has agreed to. So on the other side of the transatlantic with our American partners. That is, in a way, I'm sorry to say, a bit of a European question.
I'm sure it is.
And I've been asking this myself as well, but are we not ashamed that in these 75 years now, I mean, after the Second World War, our continent was in ruins. That was a good excuse not to be able to do what the Americans could do for us. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, we were simply not united. That was a good excuse to not do what the Americans could then do for us. But what, Charles, I would argue, is our excuse now? What is our excuse now? We are rich. We're, by the measure of it, we're richer than the United States. But are we willing? Now, the will is increasing. That's good. And when we reach Washington, then on procurement and air missile defense, and on the 2%, the Lithuania commitment, the Asia-Pacific cooperation, that's all fine. But I would argue, and I wrote an article for this conference, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics because we have 2 days where we can discuss this, but hopefully we can put it on your website and then you can look it up. But I would argue that we have to go back to this old idea that John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, pushed for in 1962 in Paris, NATO conference at the time, where he said we need the Europeans to build their own pillar. It does not make sense to come up with some form of European EU duplication. But I can tell you one thing, that if the Russians win in Ukraine, and we can debate what winning means, but if they win in Ukraine, that will be the end of Europe. It will be the end of Europe as we know it. Also civil Europe. So there's only one way, and that is what we need to make sure that we toughen up in order to support Ukraine. Now, the French president has said a lot of interesting things over time. He's also been very honest. If you compare, for example, what he said a couple of years ago, and I'm not just referring to NATO being brain dead, because that was a provocation, but in the beginning of the conflict with Russia, he said, let's not humiliate Russia. And now what is he saying? I mean, in 2023 in Bratislava, the other week in Sorbonne, he's basically pushing for European sovereignty. Now, we have to be also within a military context. Now, it might sound strange from a Northern European guy to actually applaud the French president for this. Because I think that the whole idea of autonomy, it's a bit of a pipe dream. And because of the examples I just gave, I mean, autonomy sort of gives you the idea that we at this continent could be doing it by ourselves. We can't. We won't. It's actually even undesirable. We need the Americans, but we need to also toughen up. Now, in light of a new American president, whether that will be Trump, potentially a presidency of revenge, this time he comes in without the adults in the room, it is of extreme importance that we grow this European pillar. We don't have a lot of time. I call the article Now or Never. Making this European pillar could consist of a couple of things, and I will end up with that, because of time we can discuss in more detail. If we go back to 2011, we had the Libya operation. And what happened then is that the European Council de facto started functioning as a Security Council, with the President of the European Council basically being put by the French in this particular case in charge of this crisis response of Europe. Now, there is a lot to be said about what went wrong with military deployment on the French side, on the British side. But what I think is more important is that it sort of gave us an idea of what could have been. What would happen if we transform the European Council to a Security Council? Have these Security Councils be prepared by both NATO and EU ambassadors, and give a standing invitation to those NATO members that are not EU members. So we're talking Norway there. We're talking Turkey. Yes, it is difficult to say this, but we're talking Turkey. And obviously we're talking UK.
Yeah.
Now, it's only a start. And then I'd like to elaborate on this further during the conference. But we need to fill this cockpit. This European foreign policy defense cockpit is unfilled. And the best way to illustrate that is when you look at the remarks the French president made on putting boots on the ground. He alluded to the fact that maybe boots could be put on the ground in Ukraine. And what happened? Throughout Europe, everybody said, no, that won't happen. My prime minister said it. Throughout Europe, everybody felt obliged to immediately counter the narrative, and I was just speaking to it, of the French president. We couldn't have made it more easy for Mr. Putin. We could have also been silent, even if you do not agree with the French president. We could have been silent and then kept him guessing, the man in Moscow. Well, the man in Moscow today takes up his 5th term. Yesterday, he summoned both French and British UK ambassadors to the Kremlin, for the obvious reasons that the UK had alluded to sending long-range missiles. French president, of course, with his remarks on potentially having boots on the ground in Ukraine. We strengthened the narrative of the Russians by being not unified, not even in our messaging. So it starts at PR, it starts at the narrative. I agree with you, Carmen. I don't know what your next job is, but maybe this should be your next job.
Thank you very much, Han. I am a Rutte fan.
Are you?
I am a Rutte fan.
Good.
And one of the reasons, and Mida may remember this, we had lunch. We don't often have lunch with the Spanish Prime Minister. don't get me wrong. It's only happened once in recent years. But we had lunch with him, and he asked me, what's the most interesting thing I've done in foreign policy? And I thought, well, that's a hell of a question. And I answered your non-paper on strategic autonomy with Rutte.
Indeed, with Rutte, yeah.
He was amazed that anyone had ever heard of that, of course. But the point is...
I have to honestly tell you that Rutte tried to keep it quiet in our country. But,
I know.
But I agree with you. It was one of the... it's a good cooperation between the two countries.
It is, and you know, we were in Klingendal a couple of weeks ago making this point, so we identify with this. And I also agree with your point that strategic autonomy may not be either a very good idea or a very good term. I think strategic responsibility is really what we're aiming for. How worried are you, Han, in view of what you've said, about, let me bring you down to the specifics of a Trump victory.
Yeah.
A lot of people in Washington are telling us, you know, don't worry, NATO will survive Trump 2.0. He's just huffing and puffing, and this is the way that he likes to communicate. We were also told that the next threshold, spending threshold, will be 3.5% of GDP. That'll be fun to watch. What's your gut feeling here? You've been following this for many years. Do you think that NATO is really facing an existential challenge if Trump wins in November?
The remark NATO facing an existential challenge has been made almost as many times as there's been wake-up calls. So maybe there's an inflation of that term, but I would say I'm very worried about what will happen this time around when Trump would take helm for a second time. He comes in with 4,000 people that have been prepared, think tankers, etc. It is, as I call, potentially a presidency of revenge. Now, all of us know that the man is a transactional figure. So I think we need to be clever about this. I think there's two ways to answer this. And may I... the Americans are now... it's like, almost like their pensioned agent, no, not an agent, police officer, that's being called back into the worst neighborhoods of the world yet again, because there's nobody else who's willing or capable or able to do it. And Trump has a point when he says that we're not willing to do that any longer. But then again, the Americans, I mean, even Obama faced that. You alluded to Syria, the red line. The Americans are always drawn back into the theaters that they want to leave, and some of them some of the presidents promised to leave. So I'm afraid for Trump that's going to be the same thing. Now, we can alleviate pressure on an American president and thereby alleviating pressure on us, Europeans, within NATO, by feeding the tiger here a little bit. First and foremost, we should take care of our own external borders. Here in Spain, in Rota, I believe it is, we have the Sixth Fleet, American Sixth Fleet. I wouldn't argue that they need to leave, but we could, of course, say that is a European task. We should trumpen up, so to speak, that harbor. And if you really want to do naval security or common naval security, then that is where we should first and foremost draw our attention to. That would relieve some of the American task. The Americans would be able to maybe pull some assets to Asia, Southeast Asia, where we would both benefit from that. Now, I know that there are some shortcomings, for example, interballistic missiles. The Europeans simply don't have that. I would be very blunt about this and say, listen, Mr. President, you can open up 2 new factories of Raytheon and we'll order the missiles at your place. Then he can say 2 things. First and foremost, I got the Europeans to take care of their own security and their own external borders. And I got them to pay for weaponry and make sure that in the American situation we also benefit from what they do. Now, I think going about this in a strategic way, and we can be very open about it, is one way to counter a Trump presidency. But I do not know what it will entail because, once again, this time he comes prepared. Yeah. Unfortunately.
he's going to hit the ground running, as they say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, which I can hardly see because of these lights, but never mind. Someone in the front row. Thank you. We have a microphone in the room. Muchas gracias. Si se puede presentar, por favor, antes de...
Thank you. If you could introduce yourself.
Manno from the Escuela Europea de Gerencia. Thank you so much for this important roundtable. Thank you so much, Carmen Romero, for the keynote. It was very enlightening. And my question is basically, any of the panelists could maybe elaborate. I would like to know much more about the relationship that you forecast between China, Iran, and North Korea. Carmen was saying that our adversary is Russia, but the challenge is posed, of course, from China, from North Korea, and from Iran. And I think to forecast and to not only have this wake-up call regarding Russia, but also be awakened regarding China and all these two other countries, to also forecast how is the relationship between them in terms of collective support, sharing and collaborating with the arms, and what can NATO do to prepare for the next 5-10 years?
Okay, so NATO and the axis of evil.
Yes.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, the gentleman at the back. If you could introduce yourself, si se puede presentar, por favor. Han, would you like to take the axis of evil one?
I will take care of the axis of evil, yes.
Mira,
Yeah,
jump
and
in
I
as
would
well.
like maybe if I...
Okay, por favor.
I'm Rea Armel-Enrich, retired. I'm part of the Elcano Scientific Committee. And my question is for Ana Pintos, if she's still there, which I am not sure.
Anna is not here. I'm afraid she's flying to Barcelona.
No, because...
But Carmen perhaps can answer your question since she has read the report.
She has been... I'm a bit confused about her presentation because she has been telling all that they have been doing in the report they're doing about the NATO's job on the south, and how you should approach to that with an out-of-the-box thinking, and how you should send your message. But the thing is, NATO was doing exactly that 10 years ago. I know, I was there. And in fact, there was an answer to that, which was the Southern Hub, which is in place and is doing exactly what she has been doing that NATO should do. So I'm a bit confused because she has not mentioned the Southern Hub at any rate, and I'd like to know exactly how this new report has to combine with what is already in place, which is the NATO Southern Hub.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm sorry Anna had to leave because she is catching a plane to attend one of our events in Barcelona, I believe. But perhaps Carmen would like to address that. So we have the axis of evil. We have what's new about NATO in the south, and we have Antonio Millán.
Thank you.
The microphone is coming. Who is currently based where, Antonio? Still in Israel?
Still in Israel.
Still in Israel. DCM in Israel.
3 more months only.
Okay.
Time is up now. Now, I
Sorry,
see...
Antonio is a Spanish diplomat currently attached to the Spanish embassy in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I see 3 distinguished panelists. May I kindly ask each one of you, which is your worst fear? 75 years, what is your worst fear concerning this anniversary?
Okay, that's a nice one. Thank you very much. So, if Han and Mira can answer the question about these slightly unpredictable states. Han, go ahead.
So I start off with the evil and then end up with the fear, okay? Yeah.
Perfect. Which may be related.
Yes.
Which may in fact be
and try and elude some optimism here, because
we need that. Yeah,
we need that before we go into lunch. Yes, on the axis of evil. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you make the analysis currently, then, and let me reiterate, I would like to approach this today and during this conference, I would like to approach NATO very much through a European or continental eye. Yeah. Because I think that is it's primordial that we do that we sit down and think about this and think this through. And so many developments now are warp speed against Europe, Europe as we know it. I mean, military rise of Russia, 7.1% of their GDP currently, a very successful war economy. They're on the brink of making a terrible breakthrough in Ukraine. I hope we're not too late, Carmen. You said we were not. I really hope, but hope is not a policy, as they say. We need policies to make sure that hope actually comes through. A nuclear Iran, but not just a nuclear Iran, but also an aggressive Iran that for the first time now has actually hit Israel directly and not through a proxy. North Korea on trigger mode. The WTO broke. Multilateralism dead. The digital society out of control. Democracy under threat. Autocracy on the rise. I mean, doom and gloom. Now, what is NATO doing? I think the essence of what we are doing here is that we want to preserve a liberal democratic way of living. It is the values that we share. And it's going to be extremely difficult. So my fear is not so much all these external threats that we know them, and they are on the rise. My biggest fear is that internally, on the level of citizens, we underestimate what this threat means. So it is the threat almost, it's the enemy within. If we do not realize what is at stake, that is basically our way of living, then we're bound to fail. If we do realize that, and we're strong enough even to face the axis of evil as you describe it. So that would be my point.
Yeah, if you want to
he linked his fear with revisionist powers. I mean, I just, I agree with I'm sorry. Han.
Very good.
Yeah, because you say what is your name?
Yes, I'm
sorry, Johannes. Yeah. I think that the main point here about the axis of evil is there are revisionist power, and three of them would like to become hegemonic power in their respectful region and see the U.S. as the main obstacle for that. And three of them identify the U.S. with NATO, and so they have more or less the same attitude toward the U.S. and the NATO. They are not allies, but they are strategic partners. So I think that the main job of NATO is to blockade them to become hegemonic powers in their regions. And about my fear is, I was born in Belgrade in Serbia, and I grew up with fear that how we had to see a lot of movies about the Second World War. And all these movies, of course, Nazi Germans were very bad, and they always killed a lot of partisans and tortured them and so on. And then when I was a child, I think, oh my God, my main fear was that Germans would take me and then torture me, and I will not be so brave like all partisans, because in all movies, partisans never betray any comrade. So that was really nightmare. And then I emigrated to the West, and I don't fear really, because I trust. I fear that citizens can give up, and maybe I fear less of willpower, no? Because the West has material power to do whatever really want, but the lack of willpower maybe is my main fear. But
yes,
with my fears of my childhood is nothing. So. Be happy.
Thank you very much,
I
Mila.
agree.
Can I just say something about this axis of evil, and forgive me for having coined this term, or recoined it. These are very different states. You know, the Chinese diplomats that we talk to in private say, these Russians are crazy.
Yeah.
These Russians are totally out of control. And they are dangerous. Interesting. And Iran is a world unto itself. I used to teach at Tehran University about once a year. It's a civilization, you know, it's a very special place. They don't even, as you know, they hate most Arabs, right? You know, they are not a Middle East, they hate it when you describe them as the Middle East. They're not Arabs, they're Persians, they are Shia, they hate the Sunnis. You know, this is a very peculiar actor. So and North Koreans, well, I've visited Pyongyang twice. I could bore you to death with my stories about Pyongyang. Fascinating place, by the way. But again, you know, not the best player, not the best partner to do anything with. I'm not understating the threats that Carmen identified and how some of these countries are assisting each other in their current war effort. But I don't really think we should be worried of a permanent coalition. Evil though they may be, you know, they are very transactional, they have very different interests. So I don't think that that's necessarily something that we should concentrate on specifically. I mean, obviously we have to deter the Russians. We have a lot of skin in the game in terms of the US-China rivalry. Iran is obviously a threat to peace in the region. But, you know, I think these are very separate issues and we need to treat them accordingly. Would you like to answer Antonio Millan's question about what keeps you awake at night in light of the 75th anniversary?
The alarm clock, if it rings during... No, my biggest fear is that the Ukrainian will give up because of lack of support from the West. I don't know how far we went some weeks ago when they voted in Congress, but my fear is that if that hadn't been, the bill hadn't been accepted, we were been quite close to that point.
As some of you may know, there are 180,000 Ukrainian refugees in Spain, and we were recently told that 1,000 new refugees were arriving every month. These, of course, are women and children, not males of the fighting age, but that's still a massive drain, and the population of Ukraine is now less than 30 million. So in terms of the resilience of the Ukrainian people as a nation, I think there are certainly serious concerns. So Carmen kicked off this seminar, so I'm going to ask her to finish by replying to the Admiral's very interesting question. What's new with this NATO in the South report?
Thank you for that question. So basically, what is new on the South is the fact that allies want to be as prepared to deal with the challenges from the South as we are dealing with the challenges from the East. And this is the first time that NATO, in this case the NATO Secretary General, given the fact that allies are very interested in doing more on the South, has appointed a group of experts from different countries, and I was saying 11 experts who have spoken for 2 months with the whole of the NATO enterprise, and I can tell you it's a very complex enterprise, as she was highlighting herself, and then have also gone to the partners and have spoken to them, and they have come with many proposals. Now the Secretary General has looked at all those proposals that are now public on the website of NATO, and has written 3 pages. 3 pages taking into account some of the ideas proposed by the experts. And for example, what Anna and the group have tried to do is to be more innovative, and they have focused on 3 areas. What can we do to revitalize our political dialogue with these countries, keeping in mind that they have very different interests, they are very different from each other? How can we do public diplomacy in a different way? Because we have failed. I work for public diplomacy, but we have failed to reach out to these countries because basically we have conducted very traditional public diplomacy, inviting experts, for example, to NATO headquarters. Basically, every time you do that, you have to spend 70,000 euros, and the impact is very low. So they propose more innovative ways to reach audiences in the South, where the image of NATO is very negative, and then also on which new areas or old areas can also be more effective on practical cooperation. And this takes me to the Hub of the South that you referred to, because the Hub of the South actually is one of the tools that we have, and the experts, and both the experts and the Secretary General are proposing to use the Hub in a more efficient way, because it's a body that is mainly assessing, but maybe we also need to look at possible response options based on the analysis. So one of the ideas that the SecGen, maybe I shouldn't say that, but has included in his recommendations to nations from the experts is to put together a standing NATO training mission to support nations on capacity building from the South based on basically their request, or also to appoint a special envoy for the South, as we have, for example, a special envoy for the Caucasus and Central Asia, Javier Golomina. So now what I can tell you is that the proposals from the experts have become the proposal of the Secretary General, much shorter, and 32 allies will start negotiate what will go to the allies, to the heads of state and government in Washington. And what I also can tell you is that it will reinforce the NATO role in the South.
Thank you very much, Carmen. I'm afraid all good things must come to an end, and we've run out of time. Let me also thank Luis Simon, our director in Brussels, and Natalia Martin for helping us to put this event together. Our thanks to the Bertelsmann Foundation for their hospitality, and above all, my heartfelt thanks to all of our wonderful speakers today, and to all of you for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.